Welcome to another day. Today is 4/12, 2022, and we have a special guest today. We have Rena Brio from the city of Santa Clara, and she is the Community Development Director. So we are waiting for our friend Cecilia Muela, who is tardy. Bad, Ceci. So we're bringing you, another guest to talk about the concentration on planning and code enforcement and how we correlate. So with that, we welcome our special guest. Rena, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pete. And thanks for having me on. This is a real fun experience, and I'm really excited to share what we get to do together. So, I'm Rena Brio. I'm the Assistant Director of Community Development for the City of Santa Clara. Um, I think I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and kind of where and why I'm where I'm at, or how I got to where I'm at a bit. And I would say, I am from the city of Chicago. I grew up in the city, and then we moved to the burbs when I got older. But for me, I think that is how I thought about a neighborhood, was being in a city, taking the bus, walking to the neighborhood market. I love neighborhood markets and being able to, just grab things that you need there. And that's just kind of how I was raised. I'm also a first generation American. My parents came just a couple years before I was born from India, and definitely have that immigrant experience growing up, and having other family members join us and grow up with me, and that being the 70s and 80s. So it was a different time. It was a different time. So it was a very influential part of my upbringing, though. When I think the more transformative things for me in how I got into this field was when I was older, in my early 20s. I got a chance to work abroad in Nicaragua,
Wow.
for a center for street kids. I've always been someone who's like very analytical and like interested in problem solving. But when I got to do that experience, I think that's when it hit me how much I enjoy like concrete community work and seeing your impact locally. And the organization I worked with also did microloans. So I got to work in the community with families. And I really was interested actually in doing work internationally. But I just, even at that time in my life, could appreciate the fact how close I was to my family and wouldn't want to live abroad, right? It's kind of weird, right? So I ironically took a test, and this is so weird. I should have told you this first. I took a test when I was like 19, like a career assessment test at our career center in college. And it said I should be a city planner. And I'd never even heard of it. And I just have to say, like, that never influenced my path. It was just sort of like, oh, what is city planning? Never even thought about it. But after I had that experience in Nicaragua, I really wanted to study more about local impact. And so I went to Berkeley. I got a master's degree in city planning. And for me, that degree it's for people who are unaware of it. You can go and be a city planner, but you can also just do a whole lot of things. And so for me, when I went into that, I was really interested in policy work. I was interested in housing, and I narrowed my focus a little bit. I wrote my master's thesis on, which seems kind of futuristic today because like we talk a lot about accessory dwelling units in California now, but that was my master's report, like 20 years ago. And on how it could support affordable housing and the provision of affordable housing in California. And I say this because like, it's just funny how things really do kind of happen over time, and there's a little spark you have and it kind of materializes. But I would just say that I got to work for the city of San Jose. I did some work for a nonprofit at first, and I just started out being a city planner. And I had a wonderful set of mentors. I did current planning, long range planning, got to work on some controversial projects. Maybe we'll get into that at some point. But there was we talk now about the Great Resignation, but like when I was entering the workforce early on, it was the Great Recession. And that city had to cut a tremendous number of people. And the planning department cut a third of its staff, and I was one of them. And for those of you who work in local government, you know, when those cycles of the economy hit, you realize, you know, no matter what you do, it becomes very unpersonal, personal. When you get let go, it is because you have a certain level of seniority, right? So for me, that was really hard because I loved my job and I really loved the career. But there was a reality of just not having jobs at that point in time during the Great Recession. And I got a really interesting opportunity to interview for a few jobs that the city did have because they made that available for the current employees. And I got to interview with our environmental services department in San Jose. And I ended up being the contract manager of the city's largest contract that oversaw all garbage recycling collection processing for businesses for a city. You know, San Jose is the 10th largest city in the country, right? So it was like a real career pivot for me. I still stayed working for a city, but picked up a totally different skill set. And it was working with these contractors who were competitors, who kind of personally wanted to see each other fail, but we needed to bring them together to successfully provide, you know, good customer service, but then also create a diversion rate that we were striving to be like the best in the nation. So that was a really interesting career pivot that I definitely did not intend in any way, but I got all these skills from that experience and really looking at customer service models too. And I would say that I then, you know, the economy picked up, we got out of the Great Recession, and I thought, you know, I want to get back into flexing development, like the skills I built around development. So I went to San Jose's Office of Economic Development, and I supported businesses to help them grow in the city, help them come to the city, be the advocate, because, you know, things can be difficult if you're trying to get things accomplished, you know, just navigating the process. And so I was, you know, an internal advocate. And I was also out there in the community and visible to people so that they could reach out to me for help and assistance. And I also got to work. I also got to work on a program to bring revenue in to the city by those relationships we were making with businesses. And it was great to be outward facing, right? Rather than, you know, as working internally in the city. And then while I was there, it was in the city manager's office. You know, a lot of times it's about exposure, right? Getting opportunities about who are you working with, right? And so at that point, they had lost a division manager really unexpectedly in that part of in planning. So I was in the city manager's office at that point, and they said, "Hey, Rena, you know, would you fill in until our recruitment process is going to take a really long time? Can you step up? We're having some challenges here." And so I went into that team. I was a division manager. I oversaw all of the environmental review, all the current planning projects. We were doing a ton of high-rise development. The BART, right, project is getting, for those of you who don't know, I know you've got listeners from around the country. It's really a subway system that connects the entire Bay Area, and it was getting connected to San Jose and coming in through our downtown. And it's a project that's breaking ground right now, but a few years ago, we were still in that process of making sure that, you know, BART was going to be all good through construction. So we were working on those kind of issues. And, you know, I had a great time in that role. I loved like being part of a team and leading a team. And so that's the time really that I got to come over to the city of Santa Clara. And in San Jose, you know, it's like city of 1 million people. They have multiple divisions, but in Santa Clara, you know, I got to come over as the planning manager and oversee all city planning and, you know, everything, including our code enforcement team. And I got to do that for 3.5 years. They created a new position, assistant director, and it's really to provide that support across the entire department. So it's planning, building, housing. Like I said, we have code enforcement in planning, and we also have it in our building division. And so it's been a great go. This is a relatively new position for me, getting to work across our divisions, but I just really love sort of been a meandering career, if you will. Some of it's been intentional, some of it's been not. But it's like looking back, rear view. It's been all good, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. So that's kind of how I'm here. And just a little snapshot. I don't know if you're going to ask me about Santa Clara for those of people who don't know about it. It's a city about of 120,000 folks, and we're in the Bay Area, home to many tech headquarters. If you've heard of NVIDIA, Intel, Applied Materials, those are companies that are headquartered here, as well as like a lot of just household names are have their presence here. But we're also a community of lots of old historic neighborhoods. And that's a big part of like the code enforcement work we do. We have a university, Santa Clara University. And there's that town gown relationship that our code enforcement team works on all the time. And I would say we also we've definitely been put on the map in recent years, because if you follow the San Francisco 49ers, the Levi's Stadium is in Santa Clara. So that's entered another element, right, of community relationship with a different kind of user. So lots of interesting things going on in Santa Clara for a city, of not super large city, but definitely a fair amount of complexity. So
Yeah. So first of all, so I'm gonna apologize for all my Dodger hats in the back, since you and Ceci are yeah. Since you and Ceci are 49er fans, I guess I'm assuming, but no. So let's go back. And one of the reasons why we wanted you on the show was, as you know, code enforcement tends to be housed all over the place in public works, and and building, and the code enforcement standalone. I sit in the city manager's office. I've seen it in the city attorney's office. So we're all over the place. We sometimes people say, hey, we're the jack of all trades, master of none. So we just kind of get the crumbs. And one of the things is, I think people forget the whole that planning. Even though you have your own function, using those land use tools are so essential for code enforcement officers. Now, I have the privilege to work under planning in my past, so I understand the conditional use permits, and and I'm going to bring it back to basics, because a lot of our viewers aren't in planning, or haven't been in planning, or they wouldn't know how to use a variance, or they wouldn't talk about even like types of brownfields, or environmental issues that may arise just being part of the planning department, and sometimes even touching different types of business, or
yeah.
And so when we talk about how in your city there's some in building and some in planning, it's crazy, because the process should all be the same, but in a lot of cities it's not. It's just a little bit different. So can you tell us a little bit of how the way code enforcement is used in your planning division?
Yeah, no. And so in planning, and I'll take even 10 steps back, because I'm used to people being like, what do you do all day, right? Like, what is city planning? And I'm in a room with a lot of maps. They actually happen to be public works maps, but what planning does is it thinks about the future a lot. It thinks about process, and it thinks about engagement of the community to define the future. And so in planning, we have something called the general plan, right? And that speaks to, if a piece of land were to develop in the future, what is the community's vision for what it will become? Is it the same land use? Is it like changing? Is it like single family homes and it's changing to office? Is it a new neighborhood? In Santa Clara, we're actually building a lot of housing, and we are building new neighborhoods. So that's a part of what was the vision of what a land will become. And it's also zoning, right? So it's like, what do you deal with the uses that are there today? If somebody wants to propose a nightclub, for instance, right? Like, the community may be okay with the nightclub there, but they might want to talk about it in depth and really understand its operational plan. They want to put limitations on it. So what the zoning will tell you is, on that piece of property, what's permitted, what's not permitted, like you absolutely can't do something. And then there's like ways that you can regulate a use. Like, as you were saying, Pete, the use permit process, right? Or conditional use, special use. And those take you through a public hearing process usually. And then the city can apply conditions on it. Like, hey, nightclub, you have to be done at midnight. And you cannot operate on Monday through Thursday, right? Or your noise levels have to be at this certain level. And that's really, for us, I think why code enforcement is so important is because it protects that community process and gives power to it. If we've gone, 10 years ago when something was getting built and the community got involved and said, what's really important for us is that someone build like a wall here, because we're okay with you having your loading and stuff, but this wall is super important. And then over time, the project gets built and then the wall gets taken down and then there's an issue, right? And really what we have to turn to is code enforcement to say, hey, what was supposed to be there? And can you get us back to what our community had said they were going to be okay with? And I think that there's that accountability, that we do all of this work, but if people aren't accountable for their actions, then like that really devalues that whole process, right? So I think code enforcement is a really important part of planning in terms of implementing that community vision, and then also problem solving, right? I mean, you guys spend your day probably not on the easy stuff. You're spending your day on the things that there's like a ton of gray area, right? And how do you navigate that gray area? So I think that that's where planning intersects really well with code enforcement. Like, where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? How do we get people to cooperate with us? And they're coming at it from different perspectives, right? So I think that for me, that's how planning and code enforcement really work together, is finding people accountable, but also just problem solving. And code enforcement's in that community. Like in Santa Clara, we have a neighborhood relations group. It's called NERC. We meet quarterly, and it's to deal with that town-gown relationship between Santa Clara University and the neighborhood around it. And our code enforcement officers, after years and years of just ongoing challenges, it's now part of like our proactive code enforcement, where our code enforcement officers go every week to that neighborhood. They're able to see what's happened over the weekend. Have people left furniture out, and they have a rapport with the community members. They have a rapport with the students. They have a rapport with the property management companies. They have a rapport with the property owners. And that's like the most important thing, right? And how do you get compliance, right? So we, at the beginning of the year, our code enforcement team literally goes with our police department, knocks on doors, and says, hey, welcome to the neighborhood, students. Like, we want to tell you about like our expectations here.
Wow.
And that gives them them, and we were in a troubling position because we, year after year, students obviously aren't there all the time, right? They switch up, and it was like, well, we would get to a certain place finally, and then they would leave, and it would be like interacting with new people. So I think they've really gotten ahead of that, and they do that proactive relationship building. And then when we need to, there's definitely finding the students accountable. They're not always students, right? There's other issues going on in that neighborhood, but that tension is there between the rotating inhabitants of that neighborhood with the people who want to be there, like, and just have a traditional lifestyle. So I think for us, like, that's been so important. And really that's code enforcement, the relationships they build and the community, instead of them being just like, oh, the city isn't doing anything. They can see that we are trying to bridge that gap for them. So that's I would say, really, really great ongoing work for us.
And here's kind of going back to something that we said, in a lot of towns, code enforcement is in its own silo, and planning it's in its own silo, and building it's in its own silo, and a lot of times they don't communicate. So and having been in a planning division, sometimes I see the importance of enforcing these conditional use permits, because, like you said, maybe the nightclub shouldn't be open on Monday through Thursdays, and they're having Tuesday ladies' night or something, and people have to go to work the next day, so the music's bumping, and and what happens a lot of times, folks forget to enforce their own conditions. And I'll give you an example, because we had a recycling place that came in, and part of their conditions was for them to donate a tree every 57,000 tons of recyclable.
Uh-huh.
And that was a condition that was put on, but nobody enforced it. And then I come here like 10 years later, I'm like, hey, this guy owes us like 1,000,000 trees. Well, we ended up settling, but it was based on their conditions, and we're like, look, yes, going through the revocation takes forever, and it can get really, really political really fast. And we sit at a certain level where we understand the whole politics of the you're revoking a store's CUP because they're violating this, but at the same time they're bringing X amount of revenue into the city, and you get into that. Okay, um, you know the beautiful thing about planning is you're always able to come back and modify your conditional use permit. Some things, and people don't understand that. When we talk to these business owners, like, a lot of times, yes, you agree to this. I know you can't agree to it anymore because times are changing, or I've seen some crazy conditions. I saw a hotel where, like, Hispanic couldn't live in the back house, and I'm like, what?
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
It's still there, but you're not going to
Right.
enforce it anymore.
Right. That's definitely been part of the storyline.
And then so for me, it's important. Like, what do you say to when you get these type of calls, then that CUP hasn't enforced in years, and all of a sudden the city's asking for enforcement. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really, and how you set that up, Pete, is really good, because there are consequences for everyone, right? There's consequences for the community when you just go about your business and you don't care about who's around you. And that's something that they need to be aware of, because, we all live in our own bubbles where we focus on the world we're in. And I think it's, first of all, making them aware, right? Like the consequences that they're having on others, and doing that education, giving people the benefit of the doubt to correct themselves. And then, I think that our community looks to us because they don't, one, necessarily feel comfortable going to a business, right? And they look to us because they know that we have authority, right? So I think it's, first of all, communicating to that business owner, and then giving them like a plan, like, what's your plan, and giving them those options for how they can correct, and being flexible about it. And I think you're absolutely right, Pete. Sometimes we have things that hem people in, and we need to be able to say, hey, these are the options. These are the easiest ways that you can go about addressing this. This is the harder way for you to do it. And I think it's just important for people to understand, like, why do I have to care? Because, Pete, a lot of times, and this happens with noise all the time, right?
Mhm.
Like, you clock them and you're like, oh, you meet the city's noise standard. But this is actually really irritating to hear this all the time. But I don't have anything that we can, you know, do anything about from a, like, pressing this as like a code issue. And I think that's where, honestly, there's a distinction between that community conversation you need to have with someone, right? To say, you're a long-standing business here. You employ tons of people, but your equipment is really loud. And the people who live back here, they experience this all the time. So what can you do about it? And it's not you have to do something about it. It's what can you do about it? And then sometimes you need to connect the dots for people, right? For instance, if you ever want to expand, we'll have to have a public hearing. And I'm sure the neighborhood is going to talk about their experiences
I
in
love it.
with you.
I love it.
Oh, I actually might want to do that in the future, right? So it is like a lot about getting people to comply, even if you don't have the hammer, right? And when you do have a hammer, you still have choices for people, right? You can be like, you can do it this way, you can do it that way. And being the expert, the pro in your field, you can lay out those options for them so that they don't think that they're only hemmed into like one solution.
I had a mentor that told me to use the velvet glove. How about you, Sephora?
Oh,
That's awesome. So Rena, so many great points that you're bringing up. One of the things that I wanted to elaborate a little bit on is the importance of the town gown relationship, and that typically, for those that don't quite understand what that means, town gown relationship is when you have the residents of a community come together with students and faculty of a school that is pretty prominent in that particular area. And it's so significant to have the ongoing meetings. And I was so pleased to hear that you guys invest in attending those meetings and in your code staff as well, because that's how you get that communication started and you start bridging bridging that gap, if you will, like you mentioned, where you start having the conversations as to what's working, what isn't working, how can we make it better, and you start getting that community input, and at the same time providing the mechanism for what ordinances say, how they should be applied, how they're going to be applied, the enforcement component of it. So it's really awesome to see that, because that's another facet of community engagement that we need to see take more practice, right? Especially in these towns and cities that have the large universities and colleges within those particular areas. The one other thing that you mentioned, the general plan, I got to tell you that when I started in the building industry, I had no idea what a general plan was. No idea. And then as I started kind of going through the permit teching side of things, the code enforcement side of things, it just kind of forced me to get into the weeds of what is the general plan? How do I use this to enforce? How do I understand, what certain things are allowed that are not perhaps in the zoning code, but the general plan allows it, and how those kind of interface with each other. And then I had the opportunity in Marin, when I was at one of the municipalities there, the director of planning and economic development invited me over to assist as a translator for the general plan update. And I was mind blown.
cool.
I thought it was so great. Yeah, and you know what? And to be able to serve as a translator to the community, to the Spanish speaking community, and say, hey, exactly what you said, Rena. What do you want to see? What don't you want to see? What's working out? What isn't working out? Tell us about, whether there are complaints on building, whether there are complaints on code enforcement side of things, commercial land uses, industrial, whatever they may be. That's really where the rubber meets the road, because now you have a voice and a say into, hey, you know what, I live here and I want to, build and have a family and have history and basically, lay down some roots. But also I want to be involved with my community. How do I do that? And that's how you do it. You get involved with all of those planning meetings, the general plan updates, ask the questions. If you see those notices that say, hey, if you have any questions, call so-and-so planner, call them. Call them, get involved, do the things. The other thing too is early on, I heard you mention something about spending some time in Nicaragua. And I think that is so great, because it gives you another perspective of construction and architecture and how things are done, infrastructure, if you will, as well. That then allows you to kind of open your mind to different ideas, different ways of seeing things and viewing things. So I could really appreciate that element that you bring into Santa Clara, because Santa Clara, as everybody knows, is Silicon Valley, right? That's the tech world, tech capital, Bay Area. They have great places, great eateries. So it's just a really hopping spot. But it's nice to see that additional insight that you bring from having experience in Nicaragua, that helps you kind of, okay, well, let's look at things in a different way, and you have like a different vision as to what you'd like to see, but also taking into account the current opinions of your residents. So that, I think, is really great.
Thank you. No, I mean, it is really interesting to me just being able to get out of the world you're in and try going somewhere different. And it's funny, you know, Cecilia, when I was in Nicaragua, I stayed with a family and they lived on a traditional house that had a patio in the middle, as many houses in Central America have. And in that patio, we would do a lot of things. It was our public, not really public space, it was part of the house, right? But the hillside was around us and covered with, I would call like very man-made structures, right? And I would just be going about my day and look up and see like all sorts of people staring at me, right? And it was just, it's like, oh, this is just how life is. Like everyone is comfortable being around each other, and there isn't this crazy sense of like privacy, right? I mean, that is very much like an entitled perspective that we have in our Western kind of world, right? And it's just good, I think, to get out and experience any different culture. I love Silicon Valley from the standpoint of being around, and California in general, right? But being around so much diversity.
Yes.
And I did get to participate in the city's redistricting, which for those of you who don't know, right, our census data is out now. Every 10 years, your population around the entire country has changed. And it would be really cool for you to go to the census website and look at those demographics that happened in 2020. Like, what's the difference between 2010 and 2020? And how has your community changed? Right. And are you responding to the way that your community has changed in how you provide those services? And so to me, like what's really fascinating about Santa Clara is it has really changed from a diversity standpoint. And it has changed very significantly around the Asian community. We have, and when I say Asian, I even put, you know, some people consider Indians Asian, I consider myself Asian, I'm Indian. So Asian collectively is a much more significant part of our community in Santa Clara. And I think that's important to tell that and represent that in our community. So I just throw that in. Thank you for Cecilia for throwing, you know, that's an experience that was formative, but it was a while back.
Yeah, no, I always think it's so remarkable that the bits and pieces that we take from experiences and travel, right? Because it gives you a different perspective, and it allows you to look at life a little broader in the regards that you're looking at how you're pursuing processes and changes in your city, your municipality, in such a way that you are tapping in to the equitable component of that diversity. Just like you said, and I couldn't agree with you more, you know, when you have that census information in code enforcement, Pete and I are really big at saying you have to learn your craft. You have to know your craft. And part of that is, yes, tap into the census, know exactly what's happening in your particular municipality and surroundings, so that you can kind of gauge, okay, where do I need to provide more service or better service or augment my service, right? Whether it's, you know, let's make it, accessible in the means of providing translation services or documentation that's in a variety of different languages, or let's have town halls or community engagement changes in the form of getting somebody on board that speaks the language, that can connect with the community. I mean, there's a variety of different ways that can be done, but it all stems back to really understanding your craft and diving into learning those aspects of how to effectively engage your community in the most positive way. In addition to that, you know, there was a question about how has your planning background helped you in code enforcement? And I will tell you, I'll be the first one to say that in my whole, journey in code enforcement and building, we've always had on our wish list, right, a planner dedicated to code. Because we run so many code cases back and forth that happen to planning. And so when I heard you say, oh yeah, we code enforcement's and planning, code enforcement's and building, I'm like, music to my ears, because that's the dream of every municipality that I've ever known, is we want a planner on board, because that really helps us, someone that's dedicated to us. But how would you say that direct experience has allowed you to kind of look at code enforcement in a broader realm? And I know you tapped into this a little bit earlier, but how would you say that allowed you to tap into a broader realm? And in addition, what would you recommend of other municipalities as far as the planning / code enforcement experience of it all? How they tie in?
Yeah, I mean, I think what can be missing sometimes for code enforcement is getting to see the bigger picture, right? Because it is like very assignment based, or there's a specific response. And I think that what's great about planning is it is all about the big picture, usually, and that what they need is more, hey, we're going to get into the details of like, if you don't think about this now, you're going to have problems down the line. So it's actually a really great partnership between like, and how many times I've heard like code enforcement say, well, too bad that condition wasn't worded a little differently, right? Because then we would have more teeth, or it would have been more effective. And so that's what's, I think, actually a lot more kind of just exposure to each other is really important. And I love, having our code enforcement, literally our officers sit right next to the planning staff, and we have our staff meetings together. They sit through some of boring conversations, but they also sit through big picture conversations too. And we hear about the work that they're doing, right? When we've been at shelter in place, right? Everyone's complaining about noise because they're all home to hear it. And is that a new trend for us?
Right.
Or is that this moment? And we're still kind of unpacking that, right? About noise in general. I don't know how much that's been everything that you guys are talking about here. It's a big thing for our community. Noise has become like much more of a daily complaint. And I think that having our code enforcement, be the face in the community, but also at our high level meetings, those NERC, the Neighborhood University Relation Committee meetings, happen quarterly, and it involves like the leadership of the university, and it involves the leadership of the city, and then it also involves like our community members. Like anyone can get in front of our electeds and say, hey, there's a party down the street and it was really loud, right? And they don't have to go to a council meeting for that. They can go to the meeting to talk about these issues and get a voice in front of people who will find other people accountable, right? So I think it's great. Our code enforcement actually not just comes to those meetings, they prepare statistics and share them so that people know, like, what are our trends? Like last year, like since our last meeting, this is like where we're at with complaints, violations, people who've resolved them. Where were we last year? So I think it's just a wonderful partnership, and we honestly both groups can learn a lot more from each other, and just continuing that collaboration I think is so important. You can really tell when you know people who've worked in different areas. They are just overall have like a broader perspective and have different solutions. So yeah, that's a long way of getting at to what you.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So, on a national platform, we tap into it, and Pete and I have the pleasure of kind of traveling a little bit and getting to meet some amazing folks around the nation. But the one thing that is always true is exactly what you said is, being able to learn from each other, not just by sitting and listening, but really contributing and really bringing in some statistics and showing, hey, this is how this is impacting me. So in California, for example, we've had in the last handful of years pretty significant legislation that has changed the way that code departments interface with planning and building. And some of those have been our ADU, stay of enforcements, allowance, approvals, ministerial reviews for quick approval of ADUs and such, JDUs or junior accessory dwelling units. So that has really impacted, okay, how do we proceed with enforcement and an allowance if somebody wants to file a stay of enforcement, meeting the minimum standards of safety. And in addition, we have SB 9 currently, right? That's speaking to the home opportunity, housing opportunity, making that more accessible, what that looks like, that Home Act, what that looks like, and how it has the potential of perhaps impacting other parts of our building departments or community development, such as building and code enforcement as well. And I got to tell you that that is what I found the most, I find it the most fascinating. And even for my own code staff, I always recommend, hey, yeah, I want you to go to a planning commission meeting or a permit text, go to a planning commission meeting, go to a planning meeting, be a staple at those meetings so that you can kind of keep us all in tune of what's coming down the pipeline that has probably a direct effect and impact as to how we issue permitting, how we have to view our permitting, so that we can formulate, right, some feedback for planning as well. Because in planning, right, it happens the same way as any other department. You guys want to hear from us as well. Hey, how can we work together more collaboratively, more efficiently? And that's how we build those strong relationships, is by saying, okay, I'm coming to a meeting, I'm letting you know our perspective, then we're going to go ahead and formulate some maybe solutions or responses or whatever that's going to help us proceed with our everyday issuance of permitting and taking in applications, and also the code enforcement realm of things. So I agree. It's really important for us to not just sit and listen, but really contribute.
Yeah.
Really.
And, Cecilia, what you said, actually, it reminded me, because in Santa Clara, we're working on a zoning code update. So ironically, our code is from 1969, and we've made changes. So it's kind of like this Frankenstein document.
Yep.
And we have been working for a number of years now to do a major overhaul. And the things that our code enforcement staff have contributed to are going to be, they've been dealing with stuff for years on why our code is not sufficient in tackling those problems, right? So they have given so much feedback, and I'm just feeling so much better about this new code that we're going to be putting out, where people are going to actually be able to see, okay, these are things we can actually take action on. And a big one of those is, and I know it's kind of working, it's around the whole country, right, is short-term rentals.
Yes.
So that was something that right away I was like, code enforcement team, you guys go find the best practices, what's not working, let's do this right? So they put a lot of energy into crafting these regulations, and people totally take different approaches, and we've shared those with the community, and we've shared them with our council, and they've given us direction on them. But all of that started from really our code team learning from what was going on, really having our hands tied and being like, people expect something different. But as short-term rentals, and that's really interesting, I think that's an interesting use, because usually speaking, people want to be able to do it in their house, right? Like, I want to go to Nicaragua, and why not, Airbnb my house for a month, right? Everyone wants to do it in their house, but they never want a bad neighbor who does it, right? So you don't really want a solution that's like a yes, no. You want a solution that's going to allow people that level of comfort, that if things are getting out of hand, there's accountability, and you can pull that away. So that's something, though, that our code enforcement team was really good at trying to massage to get us to that good. I mean, it still needs to be adopted, but I feel like we're in a much better position with that now than we've been in the past. And that's really our team really diving into that and helping us understand, how do we make this something we can implement in the community.
So one of the things, Rena, that I really love is, when we scour the United States for planning divisions and stuff, knowing the knowledge of anything planning and code enforcement, you'd be surprised that either we know a lot about zoning or we know nothing about zoning. And it's just insane. So I think when people have an understanding of how planning works, how an ordinance is formed, and working in a place where code enforcement didn't communicate with planning so much, and then we hear an ordinance pass, like a cannabis bill, and we're like, hey, all of a sudden we have to enforce it. We're like, we had no input.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of disservice that code enforcement officers do for themselves when they're not involved, or at least aware of what's going on. When we're talking about these MECOs, or we're talking about, like you said, ADUs and JADUs and stays, and there's a lot of folks that don't go and read these new ordinances that are passed either by resolution, and to me it's so important. For planning holds the key to a lot of these planning these things, and I think they need to communicate with planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's totally right. I also am critical of the fact that we're not engaging code enforcement, right? Like I hear you. I think you're absolutely right. And I think people who are listening, absolutely raise your hand and say, oh, you're working on a new code? Can I work on that with you? Like, can I read that? Can I give you some input? So absolutely empower yourself to do that. But I also think, people who are writing codes, I think we go through this process of listening to the community, right? But like we need to listen to our internal stakeholders as well, because they have so much insight, and that's something that I think, there's improvement on both sides, and it's not perfect really anywhere. I'm really happy that we have that here, more than other places, but it's I think that's great, Pete. I think it would be really wonderful, but I think it's really important for people who are listening to say, you know what, I'm going to actually add value, and I need to raise my hand and get involved in this, because what I'm going to contribute is a different way of seeing things than people are thinking about. And they need to be thinking about it right now when we're creating the law. So please, don't wait to be asked, get yourself in that room, and be a person who's sitting at the table helping to formulate those things. I think you need to feel how valuable your input is in a way that other people can't contribute.
And one of the things it's establishing like these ordinances, and I'll give you an example on the short-term rentals. I've been on both sides where I've sat it for maybe 2 years in city council meetings, because we had a band. They were banned, so we had a group of people who are like, hey, it's going to raise revenue, city's going to benefit from it, we're bringing in tourism. And then you had this other group like, hey, this guy, they keep throwing parties next door. So you're going to have a lot of that. When you're establishing a short-term rental program, it's so rough. But one of the things that comes out of these regulations, and like earlier I gave you an example of the tree donation thing that we had in our conditions. A lot of times it's something simple that a code officer can say for a conditional use permit. Hey, I remove graffiti within 48 hours of, something that simple, where people forget, oh, you cannot leave abandoned cars in the parking lot, or, these kind of things. People overlook these things. Planners overlook this. But code enforcement is like, hey, we have this, this shopping center. There's all these vacant cars in the rear lot, So, we add these conditions and say, hey, we need to sit down, because this is the potential of what can happen, So I think for me, planning and code enforcement really need to communicate, on all levels, whether it's, a simple, a lot of planning approval. Sometimes, it's something.
And Pete, sometimes it's like, it's so prevalent that you are dealing with an issue that it almost doesn't make sense for it to be a condition of that project anymore. But like, hey, we citywide, we just need an ordinance to deal with this. An example of that is we have so many issues around construction parking. People park in a neighborhood with all the workers come, but then they don't address like, where are the workers going to park? So now, like with our zoning code update, we have like an ordinance now that's going to deal with, if you are going to generate these many construction folks, you're going to have to find a place for them to park. You're going to maybe need to procure a parking lot and get a shuttle, right? And arrange that, or you need to provide us a plan. And like, that's something, Pete, like it just kept coming up. And we're like, well, there's nothing unique about this. This is a citywide concern when you're generating so much construction traffic. So I think, yeah, code enforcement has been so helpful, I think, to guiding, guiding how we need to approach things in general. Yeah.
Well, if there's something to take out of the conversation that we've had, is don't be the person who sits in the back of the room at the meeting. Be front and center, get heard. Be that me person. Share your thoughts, your ideas. Definitely try to invest some time in going to these planning meetings. Definitely try to develop a community engagement program. And if you live in a municipality, a jurisdiction where you do find yourself, having to deal with even the collegiate community, the universities, then, establish that town and gown approach that allows you to get out there front and center and do the community engagement in that regard. I think we've had just a fascinating time with you, Rena, just really learning everything. But I don't want to end the show with simply just all the great things that you shared with us. I definitely want to congratulate you on your promotion.
Thank you.
I know Pete and I have been watching you for a while. We're like, oh my God, look at Rena got, a promotion. That's so great. That's really cool. So definitely huge congratulations to you on your new role. I know it's you've been in it for a while, but congratulations nonetheless. It's great to see someone of your caliber out there doing the great work that you do, and making those efforts to really connect and break down those internal silos and get everybody involved and engaged. And so that's always really great to see, for sure.
Thank you. And I have enjoyed watching you both too quite a bit. And I'm always learning. I'm always learning by whatever you put in front of my path. So thanks for doing that for the broader community. You don't know if that person who's watching you is a planner, right? Who's trying to learn more about your industry. And so thank you both. It's been really fabulous to see you out there, and not just, promoting the industries, but the individuals. And I really do appreciate the boundaries and barriers you both have broken yourselves, right? I have a full appreciation for that. So thanks for giving back, and then some. I know there are a lot of people who benefit. So
Yeah, we had to give planning their love today, and we're gonna have more planners on it, because you know what? I think planning is one of those tools that people don't utilize as much as they can, because it's an effective tool. I mean, we have we have so many stuff in building, but planning, revoking these permits, or dealing with these land uses, even citations, administrative citations, they're in the zoning code, so.
True.
Mhm.
When I was a permit technician, I had, and in the particular city that I started out as a permit tech, or continued as a permit tech, if I will, we were charged with not just the issuance of permits and taking in applications, but we actually needed to know the zoning code. And so I remember when we had a little bit of downtime during those holidays, I took my zoning code and I sleeved it with plastic sleeves, because I needed to make sure it was protected, because I'm tedious about certain things. And I did it specifically so I could have my sticky notes and write on it, and then do like the dry erase. But I would tell everybody, this is my Bible. And I would know when somebody would move my code, and I was like, who took my zoning Bible? Put it back right now. Because it really, you learn so much. And I can't tell you enough how I think it's so fundamental to even have your tech or your admin staff really learn that part of the process, because they will expand their knowledge base so instrumentally. I mean, it'll be awesome. So yeah, it's definitely something that I recommend myself to everybody. If you haven't tapped into your zoning code, get in there, learn it, ask the questions.
She's like this with the zoning code. Look.
I am. I'm like, zoning code. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Rena, for joining us today. City of Santa Clara, proud and center and loving planning over here. So thank you, and we appreciate your time, and thank you for appearing on our show. And this will be available in a few days on our website. So it's codeenforcementeducators.com. You can catch this and all about 40 episodes of different podcasts in regards to different topics in our industry. So
thank you so much, Pete and Cecilia. I had a great time this morning, and
cool.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It was so much fun.
All right, thanks. Told you to go by fast.
Yeah, you did.
We'll be in touch.
Thank